Hey everyone, and welcome to another lecture. So tonight we're going to be talking about Jolly and Lewis's Enlightened Racism, the portions that I ask you to read of this text. And I assign this because it's a really nice example, I think, of sort of the culmination of much of the theory that we've discussed so far. Specifically, you'll see some of the themes that Fisk was talking about, the way that different audiences come to a particular television show and make different meanings out of it based on their lived experience. So this ties in with Fisk, it ties in with Hall, it ties in with uh, some of the Kellner we've read, right? And so this is, again, a really nice example that sort of brings together all these different theories. So this particular reading assignment came from a book called Enlightened Racism, which was written a couple decades back by Jolly and Lewis, and this is Jolly and Lewis. Sut Jolly is a professor of communication at UMass Amherst, and Justin Lewis is a professor of communication at Cardiff. And they got together, again, some years ago and wrote this book. And the book is about The Cosby Show. So most of you, if not all of you, are probably familiar with The Cosby Show. It was the most popular show on television throughout much of the 1980s. But when it came out, there was also some debate amongst critics. So, Jolly and Lewis tell us at the risk of simplifying critical opinion, most analyses of The Cosby Show fit into one of two camps. The show is either seen as socially progressive or as a kind of an apology for a racist system that disadvantages most black people. So to put it really plainly, there were a number of people who looked at The Cosby Show and said, this is great. It's a professional African-American family, professional parents. Cliff Huxtable, the character played by Bill Cosby, is an OBGYN, a doctor, and his wife, Claire Huxtable, is an attorney. They're very successful. They live in a very nice, super expensive brownstone in New York City. And are obviously affluent, have a terrific family. Everyone loves each other, so it's a wonderful environment, right? So a lot of people looked at this and said, oh, this is really socially progressive and it's great. But a lot of other people looked at it and said, well, it's not truly representative of the African American experience in America. And in particular, they were upset about it because the show came out during the 1980s, which many people viewed as a time, the Reagan era specifically, was a very conservative time in American history. And they viewed it as a time when a lot of the advances made by the civil rights movement during the 50s, 60s, and 70s were being eroded. So there were these two camps, and so Jolly and Lewis point this out, and they say, listen, this is basically the way this show was viewed. The focus on a black family and departure from sort of standard or accepted racial stereotypes were important because they marked a break with prior televisual representations. A number of people said if the Cosby Show had taken on racism head on in the 1980s, it would have been commercial suicide. The show wouldn't have been successful. And this is all kind of a defense, for the Cosby Show. And so some critics, like Downing, said, listen, to be as good as it is and have gotten past these barriers, the conservative movement in the 1980s and the Reagan Republican era is a major achievement in and of itself. So the general argument for the support of the Cosby Show is that the limits of the Cosby Show, or the limits of the genre itself, to some extent, we could say that no one tunes into situation comedy to deal constantly with really heavy social issues. So to continue the case for Cosby, people do point out that the show does deal with issues of race, but it does so quietly. So, for example, Jolly and Lewis mentioned the posters in Theo's room, which show black activists. There's the Cliff and Claire's grandchildren in the show are named Nelson and Winnie after Nelson and Winnie Mandela. So there are a lot of nods to black culture in the show, but it's not addressed head on. And the argument is that addressing these issues head on would alienate a lot of the white audience and make identification with the Huxtable family more difficult. So as a result, what we see in the show is that the discourse surrounding discrimination that's overt, the discrimination that they really blatantly talk about is usually not about race, but about sexism. And we see this here. I'll just play a little bit of this clip. It's kind of funny.
Hi, Rudy. Hi, Kenny.
Elvin!
Yeah.
Where's Sandra?
She went to Boston.
What's she doing there? Did you get a divorce?
No. She and her college girlfriends are having a reunion up there.
Did you give her permission to go? She doesn't need to get his permission. If she was a good wife, she would.
No, Kenny, no. Sandra's a very good wife, but we respect each other as individuals, so we give each other freedom. If she wants to do something, she does it.
Elvin, you need to have a talk with my brother.
Why?
He says the man has to wear the pants of the family. If he doesn't, his wife will put on his shoes and walk all over him.
Really? Well, Sandra and I are not like that. You know, she's up there having a good time, and I'm down here having a good time on my own.
Are you lonely?
Why do you ask that?
Because you're sitting here talking to two children.
All right, so you get the idea. So that was the case for Cosby. The case that was made in the press and with the critics against Cosby was that it presents an unrealistic view of the lives and experiences of typical black Americans, and again, does so during a time where the advances made during the 1960s and 70s were being eroded. And so then the idea is that the Huxtables, the family on the show, sustain the harmful myth of social mobility, that there are no glimpses of economic disadvantages or discrimination in the show, and that it generally lends credibility to the idea that anyone can make it in America. In essence, it supports the notion of the quote-unquote American dream during the 1980s, and does so in the context of the black community, when arguably that dream might not have been available to everyone. So, the critics continue. Even if legal and political inequalities are finally disappearing, economic barriers remain. And of course, the family on the show is very well off economically. The brownstone they live in, for example, if you were to try and buy something like that today, it would easily be $5 or $6 million. I mean, this is not just. It's arguable whether or not the Cosby, or rather whether the Huxtable family should even be considered upper middle class, if not just upper class, right? So there was this notion that in some way Bill Cosby, who was behind the show, was neglecting certain social realities. And again, this was a popular criticism of the show at the time. So having established all this, Jolly and Lewis set out to ask the audience. This is an audience reception study, kind of like the Radway that we looked at before. And so they want to do a major qualitative audience study about the show. And they don't want to just ask people what they think about the show. They want to talk about these issues that are raised by the critics, both positive and negative. So they set out and they do their survey in Springfield, Massachusetts, which is a predominantly white area, but they go out of their way to make sure that they have racially mixed groups. They choose 52 small focus groups, 23 of which are black, 3 Hispanic, and 26 white. And they, in order to get over some of the problems that we see with ethnography and so on, they go out of their way to make sure that they interview people in small groups so that they feel comfortable. They go to the people's homes so that they're in their own environment and in the environment in which they traditionally watch television. They always start the session with a viewing, so they sit there and they show an episode of The Cosby Show for the folks to watch. And to further this whole notion of making everyone as comfortable as possible, they sent white interviewers to speak with the white groups and black interviewers to speak with the black groups. So once they outline how they do their study, Jolly and Lewis tell us why it's important. This is one of the things that you commonly see in academic work. You tell your reader why this is important and why the study should be done. So the rationale goes like this. TV is socially significant, even if it seems like entertainment. It's art, and it can tell us something about culture and society. Number 2, these kinds of fictional TV series really do intrude into our lives in an intimate way. We get to know the characters very well. Back in the day, when you watched network TV, you'd see these characters week after week on a regular basis. And indeed, some people saw TV characters more than they saw members of their own family. Right? So they also make the case that the stronger our emotional investment is in a program or in a program's characters, that in some sense it becomes harder for us to separate fantasy from reality. And then they illustrate this in their research, and I'll show you how. So right away we get some really interesting feedback from the viewers, and what's so peculiar about this in a way is that it shows a very clear kind of blurring of the line between reality and fantasy. And talking to the people who watch the show, they quickly find that they talk about the characters in the show and about the plots and the narratives and so on in such a way that it makes it seem like they believe these characters are real people instead of fictional inventions. So, for example, you have one respondent saying, about Cliff Huxtable, oh, he had to have used babysitters to raise all these kids with, him being a successful doctor and his wife being an attorney. Now, I mean, obviously they didn't have to use babysitters because they're not real. But this is the first thing that people think of, right? Then one responds about an episode in which Theo's mother, Claire, finds a sort of a softcore porn magazine. One of them suspects that the son really wanted his mother to find that magazine all along, as if, he's a real person with real psychological motives. And then this one is probably one of my favorites. And what's going on here is that the respondent says, I like Bill Huxtable. And what's so interesting about this is that, it's Bill Cosby playing Cliff Huxtable. But the respondent has confused the names, right, in this weird kind of portmanteau-ish way. So it's I like Bill Huxtable, and it's this perfect expression of the blurring of the line between Bill Cosby, the real actor, and Cliff Huxtable, the fictional character. We see the same thing with people talking about the character of Rudy, one of the younger daughters on the show. As she grows up, the people watch the show consistently and watch her get older and comment on how she changes. Rudy is so mean. She's so different now, right? She's not the nice little girl she used to be. We see them talking about another character is Lisa Bonet's daughter. And of course, Lisa Bonet is the actress, and that's not her real daughter, but that's how people talk about her. And then we have one respondent comparing the wife on the show, Claire Huxtable, to his or her actual mother, right? I just think she's nice. She's patient. Sometimes I wish Ma would be patient. And so what you see here is the kind of social comparison, that's what it's called in social psychology, social comparison where people are comparing themselves to the people around them, but the problem is that the people they're comparing themselves to are fictional characters. And so again, this speaks to this odd kind of blurring of the line, right? Which I think is mixed up with the ontology of the photographic image and the idea that the photograph is different than other forms of representation, of artistic representation. The photograph has an actual indexical relationship with the thing that it represents. In the old days, when you took a picture and you press the button on the camera, a shutter would open, and the light bouncing off of the subject you're photographing would leave an impression on the film, like a footprint. And so there's almost a physical relationship there. And that does something. And when we watch these images, these moving images, because all they are is just a series of photographs, one after the other, moving quickly enough to appear to have motion, it gives the impression of reality in such a way that even though cognitively we know, if I asked you, is the Cosby Show real, you'd say no. But at the same time, we still, oddly enough, think of these characters as if they are in some ways. So we know better, but we still think of these characters as if they're real. And I think that has something to do, again, with the photographic image. So, there were some interesting distinctions, too, between how white viewers responded to the show and how black viewers responded to the show. And I think this neatly points out, or neatly illustrates a lot of what Fisk was saying with regard to how we engage with text, how we make different meanings from open texts, and how the meanings that we make from these texts depend on our lived experience, our fields of experience, where we've been. And so with white audiences, they talked about class, and they said, the interestingly, they said the Huxtables were both typical and upper middle class. So that's kind of a weird thing, right? They also said that the family was realistic, believable, everyday, just like a real family. And this is, again, the responses from a white audience, and specifically a working class white audience. And if we were together now, I'd ask you what you thought of the show, but obviously we don't have that opportunity since we're online. Now, when we moved up to white middle class viewers, so a higher social class, they also praised the show for being realistic and used a lot of the same terminology that the lower working class viewers used. But they added caveats and quickly said, well, it's realistic, but parts of it were unrealistic. And Jolly and Lewis attribute this to a kind of obligation to be critical of TV. Because educated people decades ago viewed TV as a lesser medium. It was the idiot box, it was the boob tube. If you watched too much TV, you were a couch potato. And so there were a lot of negative kinds of sentiment surrounding TV as a medium. So what we'd see is the middle class viewers would start by praising the realistic qualities of the show, but then criticize it for being unrealistic in the next breath. So, you have criticism, you never see Cliff as a doctor, meaning, you don't see him working. And so it'd be, I think he's a believable character, but in the next breath, he's never working, it's not realistic. So there was this weird, yeah, it's realistic, but parts of it weren't kind of feedback from the middle class white audiences. Here, too, we see another example of what I would call faith in TV images. And this one, I think, is particularly revealing. This is a respondent was interviewed who, in the interview, says to her, one woman attorney, did she remind you of Claire, the mom on the show? And the respondent says, no, not even close, because she wasn't as feminine as Claire Huxtable. And then the interviewer asks, who do you think is more typical of women attorneys? And the respondent says, Claire Huxtable. Why? Well, because I've seen other ones on television, like on the news and things like that, and they're all more feminine than the one I knew. And the reason I highlight this, and the reason that I mention it in terms of faith in TV images, is that it's kind of crazy when you really sit back and step back from it and think about it critically. What you have here is a woman whose friend was a female attorney, and the interview is saying, who do you think is more representative of a female attorney? Your friend who really is an attorney, or this character on TV? And her answer is the character on TV. So again, this is interesting because it speaks to this idea of realisticness on TV and our faith in these televisual images. So another comment that white viewers made was that Bill Cosby himself, when they view Bill Cosby specifically, they don't, quote unquote, they don't see a black person. And much of this has to do, I think, with the nature of Cosby's comedy, which was always very family-oriented and light-spirited and didn't delve into the kind of social issues or satire that you'd see from other comedians like Richard Pryor, for example, right, or Eddie Murphy, who were contemporaries with Cosby at the time. All right. So what we see then is a series of paradoxes that begin to emerge in the interviewing of the audiences and the responses. So there's this idea that the show presents everyday events believably and realistically, but the show still delivers the pleasures of fantasy. There are these realistic details of family life, right? But at the same time, elements of it, for example, them always having money while never seeming to actually do their jobs, right? That there's this kind of weird paradox, weird contrast. And for white viewers, the Huxtables appear to reflect a black culture that they enjoy. And so then it's the intermingling of these themes that allows the show style and content to interact so positively with the needs of the white audience. Okay? Now, with regard to the show itself and the idea that it's true to life, right, There is a fair amount of discussion from the respondents concerning Theo specifically, who plays the son on the show. And there is this idea that it breaks from the traditional narrative mold, what we've seen in the past with family representations and the relationship between children and parents. A lot of them cited a specific episode where Theo was caught again reading sort of a softcore porn magazine, and his mother gives him what for about it. But the character of Theo specifically really brought a lot of reactions from the respondents. And they like him because he sort of represents the typical boy. They like the relationship between the character of Theo and the character of Cliff Huxtable, the father. And they feel that the relationship that's portrayed on the show is real because even though the parents are major overachievers, one's a doctor, one's a lawyer, Theo's a D&C student. So they like this idea that it's true to life. As a result of all this, Jolly and Lewis say the Cosby Show appears to have cultivated a space where fantasy and reality are allowed to merge without suffering any philosophical qualms. So there's this idea, then, as I just said, that fantasy and reality merge up. And this, in a way, represents that same kind of liminal quality that we were talking about with Newcomb and Hirsch and the idea of the show as a cultural forum, as representing real-life kinds of scenarios and dealing with real-life kinds of social issues, but doing so in a fictional setting. And, of course, Newcomb and Hirsch suggest that this allows for the discussion of charged social issues in a relatively safe environment. Now, with regard to the show itself, in the criticisms that they're too affluent, let's say, for a realistic depiction, one of the things that the viewers point out is that nobody wants to see a repeat of what they're living themselves. And so there is this distinct sense that audiences respond positively to the aspirational nature of the program. The fact that what they're saying is, in essence, I don't tune into TV to see what I live in my day-to-day life. It's escapism to some extent. And people want to see something better, frankly, than what they have. And so there's this response, this is nice, it looks good, and you accept it. They have a beautiful home and everything's okay. Another respondent says, I like the fact that they're not a working family. The money just seems to be there. Now, of course, the parents on the show work, but by this they mean you never see the characters working, and the money seems to be there. So it's this idealized kind of quality. So, again, for the white audiences, and we'll look at the black audiences here in a minute, but for the white audiences, we see them responding to the blackness of the character. So it makes, the one respondent says, it makes it more interesting to me because he's black and it's so good, it adds to the show. Another white respondent says, I feel like they bring a lot of black culture to the show. It's an effortless blackness, a nice blackness. That's what the show brings across to me, that black people are just like us, having a regular family, the same problems, just like us. And then more viewers respond. Many white viewers described to us how they sometimes forgot that the Huxtables were black. So this is clearly the way that this is generally interpreted and how white audiences specifically thought about the show's blackness and black culture and how it's presented in the program itself. Now, with black audiences, what Jolly and Lewis found was that while white viewers looked at the Huxtables as a black family, black viewers looked at them as a black family. So, of course, the emphasis here is on different words. And black audiences reported a strength of identification. So one respondent says, they dress nice, they have nice clothes, and when I look at them, I look at us. Many reported seeing their parents in Cliff and Claire Huxtable, and overwhelmingly the Huxtables were seen by black viewers as really black. Now, I'll remind you that just a couple slides ago, you had white audiences saying that, I forgot they were black. So this is a really interesting example, I suggest, of how people from different backgrounds come to a show and make different meanings out of it, right? They literally make sense of the show differently. And the show, what was so good, to an extent, about The Cosby Show, was that it was a really open text, in using Fisk terms, right? It was an activated text, a producerly text, where audiences could go to this and take away the kind of meaning that was important to them, and that in turn made the show tremendously popular, right? The #1 TV show for almost an entire decade. All right, so this is, I'm not allowed to play this because of copyright, so I apologize for that. But hopefully what you've seen here is a good example, again, of a lot of the ideas and theories that we've discussed all semester, right? The idea of people making different kinds of readings, the idea of audiences making something popular, making an open text popular, coming to the text from their own field of experience, making the meanings that they want to get out of the show. And it illustrates, I think, quite nicely, again, how disparate these kinds of readings can be. Okay, thanks for checking out my lecture, and there'll be another one next week. Thanks again.